Edward Blackbeard Teach. On November 22, 1718, 38-year-old Edward Teach was anchored off Ocracoke Island, North Carolina. Aboard his ship Adventure, Teach, known throughout the Atlantic world as Blackbeard, had terrorized merchant ships for years with his fearsome appearance and ruthless tactics. He wore his black beard in long braids, sometimes tucking slow-burning fuses under his hat to create a demonic smoking effect. By late 1718, colonial authorities had had enough. Virginia Governor Alexander Spotswood commissioned Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy to hunt down Blackbeard. Maynard sailed south with two small sloops, light, fast, single-masted warships built for speed and maneuverability, called the Jane and the Ranger. The ships carried no heavy cannons but were packed with sailors and marines. Early on the morning of November 22nd, Maynard's vessels approached Ocracoke Inlet, where Blackbeard's ship was moored. Blackbeard spotted the approaching Royal Navy ships and prepared his crew for battle. As Maynard's sloops closed in, Blackbeard opened fire with his cannons. The opening volleys killed several of Maynard's men. Maynard ordered most of his remaining crew to hide below deck, making his ship appear nearly abandoned. Blackbeard took the bait. He brought his sloop alongside Maynard's vessel and led his pirates in boarding. As Blackbeard and his men climbed aboard, Maynard's hidden sailors suddenly emerged from below deck. A fierce hand-to-hand battle erupted on the blood-slicked deck. Blackbeard and Maynard confronted each other directly. The two men exchanged pistol shots at close range. Blackbeard was hit but continued fighting. The pirate captain drew his cutlass and struck at Maynard, breaking the officer's sword blade. As Blackbeard raised his arm to deliver what would have been a killing blow, one of Maynard's men slashed him across the throat from behind. Even with this terrible wound, Blackbeard kept fighting. Sailors surrounded him, firing pistols and hacking with cutlasses. Blackbeard absorbed approximately 5 pistol shots and 20 sword wounds before finally collapsing. The legendary pirate captain died on the deck. Maynard immediately drew his sword and severed Blackbeard's head from his body. The head was hung from the bowsprit of Maynard's sloop as a trophy. Blackbeard's headless corpse was thrown overboard into the waters of Ocracoke Inlet. Maynard sailed back to Virginia with the severed head still displayed. Upon arrival at Hampton Roads, authorities placed Blackbeard's head on a pike at the harbor entrance where it remained for years as a grim warning to anyone considering piracy. William Captain Kidd. On May 23, 1701, 56-year-old William Kidd stood at Execution Dock in Wapping, London, preparing to die. Kidd had been a respected privateer and ship captain before being accused of piracy and murder. His trial had been a spectacle, and he was convicted despite his protests that he had been betrayed by his backers. Execution Dock was London's traditional site for hanging pirates, located on the Thames River at low tide. The night before his execution, someone provided Kidd with large quantities of rum. By the time guards brought him to the scaffold the next morning, Kidd was completely drunk. He could barely stand as he was led up the gallows steps. The executioner placed the noose around Kidd's neck and positioned him on the platform. A large crowd had gathered to witness the death of the infamous Captain Kidd. The executioner pulled the lever. The platform dropped. Kidd fell through the trapdoor. Then something extraordinary happened. The rope snapped. Kidd crashed to the mud below the gallows, still alive. Some spectators shouted that this was a sign from God, that Kidd should be pardoned. Others in the crowd saw it as divine intervention. The executioner and guards quickly grabbed the dazed, drunken Kidd and dragged him back up the gallows stairs. A new rope was secured around his neck. Moments later, the trapdoor opened again. This time the rope held. William Kidd died by hanging at Execution Dock, but his ordeal wasn't over. Authorities had decided to make an extreme example of Kidd. His body was covered in tar to preserve it, then locked into an iron gibbet cage. The caged corpse was hung on a post at Tilbury Point on the Thames River. Kidd's tarred body remained on display for 3 years, slowly deteriorating as ships passed by. His head was mounted separately on a pike, and his personal effects were displayed publicly. The grim spectacle was meant to terrify any sailor who might consider turning pirate. Kidd's body hung in chains until the elements finally reduced it to bones, a warning visible to every vessel entering or leaving London. Stede Bonnet. On December 10, 1718, 30-year-old Stede Bonnet stood in Charlestown, South Carolina, preparing for his execution. Bonnet was unlike any other pirate of his era. Born into wealth on a Barbados plantation, he had abandoned his comfortable life as a gentleman to become a pirate, earning him the nickname the Gentleman Pirate. His brief piracy career had been largely unsuccessful, and he'd been captured after trying to establish a legitimate pardon. The morning of his execution, Bonnet dressed in his finest clothing as if attending a social function rather than his own hanging. He wore expensive garments befitting his aristocratic background. He even carried a small bouquet of flowers, though the blooms had wilted during his imprisonment. A militia unit assembled to escort Bonnet to the gallows. As the procession began, drummers beat a slow, somber death march. Bonnet walked through Charlestown streets toward the scaffold erected near the waterfront. Hundreds of colonists gathered to witness the execution. As Bonnet climbed the gallows steps, his composure began failing. The gentleman pirate's legs weakened, and he nearly fainted. Guards had to hold him upright as the executioner placed the noose around his neck. Bonnet was positioned on a cart beneath the gallows beam. The noose was tightened. Then the executioner cracked his whip. The cart lurched forward. Bonnet dropped, and the rope went taut. The gentleman pirate died dangling from the rope, his fine clothes and wilted flowers marking his strange end. But Charlestown authorities wanted to ensure Bonnet would not become a martyr or legend. After his body was cut down, it was taken to the marshlands below the high tide line. Workers dumped Bonnet's corpse in the muddy salt marsh, where the tides would regularly cover it. The location was kept secret. Authorities wanted the sea and elements to erase all trace of Stede Bonnet's remains, ensuring no grave could become a shrine, and no relics could inspire future pirates. The gentleman who had abandoned everything for piracy vanished into the Carolina mud. John Calico Jack Rackham. On November 18, 1720, 38-year-old John Rackham was hanged at Port Royal, Jamaica for piracy. Rackham had earned the nickname Calico Jack for his colorful calico clothing. He was famous not just for his piracy, but for having two women pirates in his crew, Anne Bonny and Mary Read, who fought as fiercely as any man. Rackham's capture had come in October 1720, when a Jamaican sloop cornered his vessel off the coast. Most of Rackham's crew, including Calico Jack himself, had been drunk below deck. Only Anne Bonny and Mary Read fought vigorously against the boarders. After capture, all were taken to Jamaica for trial. The trial was swift. Rackham was found guilty and sentenced to death. Before his execution, Anne Bonny allegedly visited him in his cell and told him, "Had you fought like a man, you need not have been hanged like a dog." On the day of his hanging, Rackham was taken to the gallows at Port Royal. A crowd gathered to watch the colorful pirate meet his end. The noose was placed around his neck. The trap opened. Calico Jack Rackham died by hanging. What happened next ensured Rackham would never be forgotten. Jamaican authorities decided his death would serve as a permanent warning. His body was removed from the gallows and locked inside an iron gibbet cage. The cage was designed to hold a human corpse upright, preventing burial. Rackham's caged body was transported to a small islet at the entrance to Port Royal Harbor. Workers erected a tall post on the tiny island and hung the gibbet cage from it. There, visible to every ship entering or leaving Port Royal, Calico Jack Rackham's body hung in its iron prison. The tropical sun baked his corpse. Seabirds picked at the remains through the cage bars. Rain and wind weathered the bones. The spot became known as Rackham's Cay. His skeleton reportedly remained on display for years, swaying in the Caribbean breeze as ships sailed past. The desiccated bones served their intended purpose as a stark warning to anyone considering piracy in Jamaican waters. Bartholomew "Black Bart" Roberts. On February 10, 1722, 40-year-old Bartholomew Roberts was commanding his ship Royal Fortune off the coast of Cape Lopez in West Africa. Roberts was the most successful pirate of the Golden Age, having captured over 400 vessels during his career. He was known for his elaborate dress, often wearing rich fabrics and gold chains. He also maintained strict discipline aboard his ships, and rarely drank, preferring tea. That morning, the British Royal Navy warship HMS Swallow appeared on the horizon. Roberts's crew had been celebrating the previous night, and many were still drunk or hungover. Despite his crew's condition, Roberts decided to engage the warship rather than flee. It was an uncharacteristic decision that would prove fatal. As the Royal Fortune closed with HMS Swallow, the British warship fired its cannons. Grape shot, clusters of small iron balls, tore across the deck of Roberts's ship. One blast struck Roberts directly. The grape shot tore through his throat, causing massive trauma. Bartholomew Roberts died instantly, collapsing on his deck while wearing his famous crimson jacket and gold chain. His crew immediately panicked. They knew that if Roberts's body was captured, the British would display it as a trophy. Roberts had made his wishes clear. He wanted no public spectacle of his corpse. His loyal crew members acted quickly. They lifted Roberts's body, still dressed in his finery, and carried it to the ship's rail. They wrapped chains around the corpse to weigh it down. Then they heaved Black Bart Roberts overboard into the Atlantic Ocean. His body sank immediately and was never recovered. Minutes after Roberts went into the sea, HMS Swallow closed in and overwhelmed the leaderless, drunken pirate crew. Most were captured and later hanged, but Roberts himself had escaped the fate of being displayed in chains. His body remained somewhere in the waters off West Africa, and his legend grew larger because no one could point to his remains hanging from a gibbet. Charles Vane. On March 29, 1721, 41-year-old Charles Vane was executed at Port Royal, Jamaica. Vane had been one of the most violent and uncompromising pirates of his era, refusing multiple offers of pardon and attacking ships without mercy. His downfall had begun when his own crew, led by Calico Jack, voted him out as captain after Vane refused to attack a French warship. Months later, Vane's ship wrecked during a hurricane. He survived on a deserted island for weeks before being rescued by a passing ship. Unfortunately for Vane, the ship's captain recognized him. Vane was transported to Jamaica, imprisoned, and tried for piracy. The verdict was never in doubt. At his trial, Vane showed no remorse and offered no defense. On the morning of his execution, guards brought Vane from his cell to the gallows erected at Port Royal. A crowd gathered to watch the notorious pirate die. Vane walked to the scaffold defiantly. Contemporary witnesses recorded that he went to his death with no plea but defiance in his eye, showing no fear or regret. The executioner placed the noose around Vane's neck. The trap opened. Charles Vane dropped and died by hanging. His defiant expression was frozen on his face. Jamaican authorities weren't satisfied with simply hanging Vane. They wanted to make an enduring example of him. His body was cut down from the gallows and covered with tar to preserve it. The tarred corpse was then wrapped in chains and hung from a gibbet post in a public location. Vane's body swayed in the Caribbean breeze, visible to colonists and sailors alike. The tarred, chained corpse hung on display for weeks, slowly deteriorating under the tropical sun. Birds pecked at the remains through the gaps in the chains. Eventually, Vane's body was reduced to bones, but even then the skeleton remained on exhibit, a grim reminder that pirates who refused mercy would receive none in return. Mary Red. On an April day in 1721, 26-year-old Mary Red died in Spanish Town Prison, Jamaica. Red had lived an extraordinary life, disguising herself as a man to serve as a soldier, and later becoming one of history's most famous female pirates. She had fought alongside Anne Bonny aboard Calico Jack Rackham's ship, and witnesses testified that she fought more courageously than most of the male pirates when their ship was captured. After their capture in October 1720, Mary Red and Anne Bonny were brought to trial with the rest of Rackham's crew. Both women were found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. However, when the judge pronounced the sentence, both women immediately declared they were pregnant. Under English law, the execution of pregnant women was postponed until after childbirth to protect the unborn child. Authorities imprisoned both women while awaiting confirmation of their pregnancies and eventual delivery. Mary Read was held in the Spanish Town Prison in Jamaica. The conditions were terrible, with poor sanitation, inadequate food, and no medical care. By April 1721, Read had developed a high fever. Some accounts suggest the fever was related to childbirth or pregnancy complications, while others simply describe it as prison fever, likely typhus or another infectious disease common in jails of that era. Prison officials noted that she died in prison, reportedly after developing a fever. Her death came quickly. Mary Red died in her cell at Spanish Town Prison, only in her mid-20s. Unlike most of her fellow pirates who died at the end of a rope or displayed in gibbets, Red's death came from illness behind bars. She was buried in an unmarked grave, likely in a common burial ground for prisoners. Anne Bonny's fate after this point remains mysterious. Historical records show she too claimed pregnancy and avoided immediate execution, but no record of her execution exists. She simply disappeared from historical accounts, leading to speculation that she was released, escaped, or died in prison without documentation. Mary Red became one of the few famous female pirates whose death came not from execution, but from disease, a common killer in the brutal prison conditions of the 18th century. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe for similar ones, and feel free to drop suggestions for the next video in the comments.